President Obama, a recent survey by Pew suggests that you don't just have a room full of fans, you have a nation of fans in India. The Pew survey says that my countrymen, 74% of them had enormous confidence in you when you were president, 77% thought of America as a positive country. And for what it may count, those percentages under your successor are just 40 and 56. So what does it feel in a country where most people think of you as a superstar?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to transmit this information to my daughters. Because those of you who are parents, I'm sure you've noticed that you are never a prophet in your own land. You know, I sit around the dinner table and they make fun of me and they think I'm silly. So I'm going to let them know of this information, that there are hundreds of millions, even billions of people who think I know what I'm talking about. Well, I do think that part of the strength of the U.S.-India relationship, and I benefited from that in terms of the work I did here, has to do with the extraordinary people-to-people ties that exist. There is a set of values, as I mentioned earlier, that we share, that's based on family and friends. Last night I went to dinner, and there was some dal, and people were trying to explain to me dal. I explained to the waiter that I didn't need to know what dal was because I had had an Indian roommate and a Pakistani roommate whose mothers had taught me how to cook dal. So I'm pretty sure I'm the first U.S. president to have a dal recipe, which is excellent. My keema is also excellent. My chicken's okay. But I use that as an example. Those kinds of connections, I think, extend beyond any policy that a government may make or the back and forth that exists in terms of the ebbs and flows of the national governments. And I think that exists between India and the United States at a level that is extraordinary and continues to grow. And I'm very happy about that because, as I said before, you have to have democracies of our size and prominence function effectively in concert in order to promote the values we care about internationally.
President Obama, we know you as a great president. Who would have thought you are a great cook as well? Can you manage a chapati?
No, chapati's too hard. You know, you have to get it just right and flaky, and it's difficult.
Let me start with the last thing you did on the last day of your last trip, the town hall on the 27th of January 2015, and you said, and I'm going to quote you, "Every person has the right to practice their faith as they choose. Nowhere is that more important than in India. India will succeed so long as it's not splintered along lines of religious faith. Diversity is our strength, and we have to guard against any effort to divide us along sectarian lines." And as you said those words, not just me, but hundreds of journalists felt this is a message to the Indian government, to Mr. Modi perhaps in particular. Was it?
No, I think it was a message to all of us. I have said the same thing in private to Prime Minister Modi, but I've said the same thing in public in the United States of America. I've said the same thing in Europe. You know, if you look at what is happening on the international stage, as I mentioned before, partly because people feel worried and insecure about all the changes that are taking place, some of which are economic, but some of which are cultural and social. There are demographic changes that are taking place, migration. People start looking different. There's a collision of cultures. People see much more vividly the differences between people. Sometimes they miss the commonalities between people just through the internet. And there is something in us, humans, that like making distinctions to make ourselves feel more important than the other person. And sometimes those are based on race, and sometimes those are based on religion. Sometimes they're based on class. They're always based on gender, and that's one of the things we need to focus on, is making sure that, because that's universal within all camps. And if you examine the course of human progress, where we have progressed is where we have reduced and if not eliminated, the barriers of these artificial distinctions. So that the reason you can have an outstanding business person who didn't simply inherit everything but built it themselves is because you have different rules now than in feudal times about who could aspire to enter into an enterprise. The reason that I'm sitting here is because somebody worked hard to reduce the barriers that said somebody who looked like me could not aspire to a certain office of leadership. And there's a counter-narrative taking place at all times, but I think it's particularly pronounced now. You're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in the United States, and sometimes you see it in India, where those old tribal impulses reassert themselves. And there are leaders who, I think, try to push back against those impulses, and then there are those who try to exploit them. And I want to make sure that we are encouraging as much as possible those voices that remind us that we work well together when we recognize our common humanity. And particularly in a country like India, where you have such an enormous Muslim population that is successful, integrated, and thinks of itself as Indian. And that is unfortunately not always the case in some other countries, where a religious minority nevertheless feels a part of. I think that is something that should be cherished and nurtured and cultivated. And I think that I think all far-sighted Indian leadership recognize that, but it's important to continually reinforce it.
President Obama, you began your answer very interestingly, and I want to pick up on it. You said this message that everyone has the right to practice the faith of their choice, and nowhere is it more important than India, is a message you've given not just publicly to the world, but privately to Mr. Modi. And I want to ask you, what was his response? How did he take the message? And I'll pause a moment and tell you why I asked, so you can answer both halves of the question together. You're aware that the Western press increasingly in the last 3 years, particularly since your speech in 2015, have been portraying India as a country where intolerance is growing. They talk about beef bans, they talk about cow vigilante lynchings, they talk about love jihads. So when you gave this message in private to the Prime Minister, there are many here who'd be keen to know, what was his response?
Well, he's a very good journalist. I think it's fair to say that my goal here is not to disclose every private conversation that I have with other leaders, but I think his impulses are to recognize the importance of Indian unity. I know that he firmly believes in the need for that in order to advance to the great nation status that India possesses and will continue, I think, to amplify in years to come. But as I said before, I think it's very important to understand this is the work of all of us. Yeah, one of the things that I say in my farewell address in the United States is that the most important office in a democracy is not the office of president or prime minister or governor or mayor. It's the office of citizen. Because by definition, each of us have a responsibility in order to make our democracy work. And I think that obviously those of us, like myself when I was president, even post-presidency, Prime Minister Modi, others, our voices have more reach, and we have an obligation to deliver these messages. But it's the task of all of us to reinforce it. One thing I will say about politicians as a general rule, this is not directed at any, because I know there's some in the audience who are, I'm sure, outstanding public servants. So this is directed at me, it's directed at every elected official. Rarely do elected officials get out too far ahead of public opinion. And so if you see a politician doing things that are questionable, one of the things, if you're a citizen, is to ask yourself, am I encouraging or supporting or giving license to the values that I'm hearing out of the politician? Because, frankly, politicians tend to be more of a mirror and more a reflection of forces in the society. Every once in a while, they get out ahead and actually lead, but oftentimes they're reflecting. And so if communities across India are saying we're not going to fall prey to division, then that will strengthen the hand of those politicians who feel the same way.
Now, President Obama, when you came for that visit, when you were the chief guest at Republic Day in 2015, you solved the problem of the nuclear liability issue that had been rankling for a while, and you called it a breakthrough understanding. To be honest, and you're aware of this, neither the American press nor the Indian press were quite as enthusiastic as you were. Almost 3 years have passed, and no meaningful step has been taken by either Westinghouse or GE to build a nuclear plant in India. So looking back, are you disappointed by the fact that the nuclear deal and solving the liability issue hasn't led to more productive results, particularly for American companies?
Well, you know, there's always a little bit of a mercantilist element to the job of leading a country. You know, you want to see your businesses doing well and engaged in other countries, and obviously the trade and cross-investment that takes place between the U.S. and India is extraordinarily important. My goal with respect to the nuclear issue was just to give Westinghouse and GE and other U.S. companies a chance, an opportunity. My job was not to guarantee that a deal goes through. That's a little bit below my pay grade at the time. I do think, in general, just to step back more broadly and look at the nuclear issue, I think the goal, from my perspective when I was president, was to assure that India, which had a significant nuclear infrastructure and remarkable scientists and needs for energy, etc., that we recognized reality. We put the nuclear issue on a stable footing so that it wasn't an impediment to strong bilateral relations, that we encouraged the kinds of safeguards and measures and international standards that all of us need to abide by. As you know, this was one of my priorities in the nuclear security summits that I hosted during my presidency, so that we wouldn't have nuclear materials falling into the hands of terrorists or non-state actors, that we were observing best practices in terms of how materials were handled and so forth. And on a wide range of those fronts, we made significant progress. The fact that particular contracts have not been signed and so forth is not something that But let me put it this way. Of the things that I lose sleep about during my presidency, that hasn't been one of them.
On the nuclear issue, there was enormous promise when you were president that India's application to join the nuclear suppliers group would come through. It hasn't. And China now is visibly and repeatedly blackballing India. How do you view this problem? And do you think China's attitude is justified, or do you think it's unwarranted?
Well, this is a sophisticated group, but I don't know if we want to get too deep in the weeds on the nuclear supply group. But the basic notion is whether India can be part of an organization of countries that have nuclear power and abide by a certain set of norms and safeguards, but are also then recognized internationally in order to be able to operate in this area. We worked very hard to try to get India into the nuclear supply group. It is true that the organization's charter is structured so that it requires unanimous consent of the members for a new member to join, and there were some who were concerned that India was short-circuiting some of the previous procedures that others had had to follow. Our argument was they are now meeting the standards that we abide by, so let's go ahead and just recognize that fact. We did not get the cooperation of every country. What we tried to then suggest was maybe there's some interim steps, an interim membership that might be available. I was not able to get that completed before I left because of resistance from some of the other countries. But I think, I'm sure Prime Minister Modi is still working on it.
But do you blame China, or do you understand China's response?
You know, I think that in international affairs, there are, it's sometimes hard to distinguish between motives of any given country. And so I wouldn't hazard to say definitively that China's objections were based on its views of competition to India versus their desires to follow certain procedures. And anyway, since it's possible that this is a project that your Prime Minister may still be working on and the U.S. government may still be working on, it probably is not wise for me to characterize the motives of one of the people who might be part of that decision-making.
Now, was Pakistan hiding Osama and therefore complicit, or was it unaware of his presence and therefore incompetent?